knowing that there's a meeting set at the White House for next Tuesday, does that give you more hope than you had, say, a couple days ago before we knew that at least all parties would be coming to the table?
Well, there is some good news here. There's a meeting scheduled, and there's a bill that's passed the House, and those are necessary steps for getting this done. But they're still very dug in. The White House insists that only a debt limit, is the answer, and that won't pass the Senate. The House has passed its bill. That won't pass the Senate. And that suggests they have to get to some other place. And there's been no real evidence of anyone willing to shift their position. And so the question becomes, how do you craft something bipartisan that can pass the House, the Senate, and be signed by the president? And they don't have a roadmap at the moment. And that's concerning because the clock is ticking.
Yeah, the clock is ticking. By our count, when the president, the House, and the Senate are all here in Washington, D.C. before June 1st, it's only 7 days, a week. That's it, unless they start changing some schedules. Do you think this is now the case of just they're going to kick the can down the road so they can actually do some proper negotiating?
I have felt for a while that this seems a lot like 2011, where both sides are dug in, the brinksmanship is real, and no one changes their position until there's an event that causes some pain and forces them to. In 2011, that was things like a downgrade, a lot of market volatility, interest rate movements. It feels like that's what it would take again. And so probably the most likely scenario is they stay locked down. They don't make any progress. Markets start to show some real volatility, and they get nervous and pass a short-term extension and then get serious about reaching a deal this summer. I don't see any evidence of them simply coming to a table and finding an agreement.
Yeah. Well, you, of course, also ran the Congressional Budget Office earlier in your career, Doug. So you have a sense of the amount of work that needs to go into this. Let's say they do kick the can on the debt ceiling. There's a suspension that brings us to fall. And now both are being negotiated. Does that sound like a realistic proposition to you? And we've thrown regular order, I presume, out the window at this point. They're going to have to cut a deal one way or the other. I don't mean to start with the jokes at this point.
No, the idea was floated earlier this year to simply do a short-term extension to September 30th and have the funding deadline for the government coincide with the debt ceiling deadline. Weirdly, many people think that improves the chances of getting things done because you have more dimensions along which to deal. Right? It's not just up or down on the debt. You have other tools. So I'm not a professional politician. I've watched them for a long, long time, but politics is the art of getting to yes, and they know their conferences. They know what their bottom lines are, and they have a better sense of getting to yes. And I actually don't care how they get to yes, but they got to raise the debt ceiling and they got to fund the government. So we stay tuned.
Well, not only do they have to raise the debt ceiling, but there's going to be a lot more issues pertaining to the White House and to Congress, because we have in front of our eyes yet again another bank that's struggling. PacWest, looking for strategic options, wants to be bought. Today, Jay Powell said, I don't have an agenda to further consolidate banks. It's healthy to have a range of different banks. But all of these banks have been dealing with the same underlying issue, which is the fact that the Fed raised interest rates very aggressively and very fast. Was the Fed in error here in terms of making sure that they were communicating with these banks on and supervising them correctly on what they were preparing to do in the interest rate environment?
It's a really good question. I mean, I don't think you can accuse the Fed of failing to communicate its plans. I mean, Chairman Powell in particular said repeatedly that they were going to move monetary policy to a restrictive position, and the rate increases kept coming. And we saw lots of periods where markets didn't believe them, and they just had to come into line. So I don't think the communication's a failure. I'm shocked that the management of the banks hasn't been better, but I'm comparably shocked that the supervision didn't pick this up and say, hey, you got to get your house in order. We have a real maturity mismatch problem, and it's going to hurt you. I believe the Fed thought that they could deal with the inflation using their interest rate and portfolio moves, and they could deal with the banks using a liquidity facility, which they set up, and that this was largely a liquidity problem in the aftermath of the sort of unique circumstances of Silicon Valley Bank. I now think that's not probably the case, that there's some genuine solvency problems out there. And that's a horse of a different color. The Fed can't really do anything about that. And the supervision better identify these banks early, start looking for private sector solutions early, and not have a bunch of weekend meetings where the government's trying to invent procedures to save banks. That's the worst case scenario.
Well, so that said, I realize a lot of this has to do with psychology, Doug, but the administration has to choose its words carefully. Do they need to stop saying that the banking system is sound and resilient, particularly if we have another here in the case of PacWest?
The banking system is sound and resilient. But they need to think about their message.
Wait a minute.
You don't want to send the president up.
PacWest is failing in front of our eyes. It's down 55%. This would be, by my count, the fifth U.S. bank, if it was to go into receivership, the fifth U.S. bank in a matter of months to fail.
Yeah, that's right. And, firms fail in the United States. In every other industry, we don't have extended coverage of it because it is the norm. We have really turned banks into something which are way too fragile, and where we don't use normal procedures to resolve them. But there's no Chapter 7, no Chapter 11, no normal reorganization as you would with any other entity in the U.S. economy. So we've created this problem. So now they need to do better supervision so that they get ahead of it. And I think the Fed really was at fault with Silicon Valley Bank and the others. And they need to start, encouraging them to find private sector partners if they've got solvency problems. And some of them do.
Well, if they can't find those partners, then, Doug, should they let PacWest fail?
I would say yes, but that will not happen. There will not be just letting a bank fail. No politician is going to take that risk. They're all incredibly risk averse. The president is it's not a fault. That's just a reality. And so,
sure,
what's amazing is we set up procedures in Dodd-Frank for resolving banks. We have orderly liquidation authorities that have never been used. Despite all of the work that has gone into monitoring the banking sector, we still find ourselves in this position. And I think that tells you something about the supervisory regime. It's not realistic, and it's not doing its job.